Over 100 million records sold. 5 top 5 singles from one album, a feat only matched by Michael Jackson and Madonna. 4 sold-out nights at Wembley Stadium. Their 1986 tour featured 9 million LED lights and drew 150,000 fans in Brazil alone. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Genesis wasn't just successful, they were unstoppable. Then it all collapsed. A founding member left wearing his wife's red dress and inflatable genitalia on stage, bitter and exhausted. The drummer who saved them became a solo megastar and walked away. The final singer was booed off stages he never asked to inherit. A comeback album bombed so hard that a 27-date North American arena tour was canceled. Then a scaled-down 22-date tour was canceled too. Members went decades refusing to share the same stage. Critics called their final album unnecessary. Fans called it betrayal. This is the story of how commercial success destroyed artistic identity, how 3 school friends became one of the biggest bands on earth, then watched their legacy fracture into a civil war over what Genesis even meant. But to understand the collapse, we have to go back to 1967, to a British public school where none of this seemed remotely possible. Charterhouse School, Godalming, Surrey. 1967. Rock and roll wasn't cool here, it was contraband. But in the dusty practice rooms, 5 teenagers who barely fit together were hammering out songs that nobody wanted. Peter Gabriel, theatrical, intense, wearing his neuroses like stage paint. Tony Banks, classically trained, cerebral, the kind of keyboardist who treated pop music like advanced mathematics. Mike Rutherford, quiet, steady, the bass player who just wanted everyone to get along. Anthony Phillips, fragile, brilliant on guitar, already showing cracks. And Chris Stewart on drums, who wouldn't last the year. They called themselves Genesis, a name handed to them by Jonathan King, a former student-turned-producer who thought these kids might have something. King was right about the name. He was wrong about everything else. Their first album, From Genesis to Revelation, dropped in 1969. It sold 650 copies. 650. They couldn't even give it away. The record label filed it under religious music by accident, burying it in record shops where prog-rock fans would never look. For most bands, that would have been the end. But Genesis had something the industry didn't understand yet. They weren't trying to be a band. They were trying to be a world. By 1970, the lineup reshuffled. Stewart was gone. Phillips cracked under the pressure and left, replaced by Steve Hackett, a guitarist who could make his instrument weep and scream in the same measure. And John Mayhew gave way to a hyperactive drummer named Phil Collins, who showed up to the audition and played like his life depended on it. This was the lineup that would change everything. Gabriel, Banks, Rutherford, Hackett, Collins. 5 artists. 5 egos. 1 vision, for now. Their sound was unlike anything on the radio. 23-minute epics. Odd-time signatures. Lyrics about mythical creatures and Victorian England and dystopian nightmares. Foxtrot, in 1972 hit number 12 in the UK and number 1 in Italy, powered by Supper's Ready. A song so long and ambitious it felt like a religious experience. Critics called them pretentious. Fans called them prophets. And Peter Gabriel? He started wearing costumes. September 28, 1972, National Stadium in Dublin. Gabriel walks on stage in his wife's red dress with a fox head mask during the musical box. No explanation. No warning. Just pure, unhinged theatricality. It was shocking. It was brilliant. It worked. By 1973, Selling England by the Pound hit number 3 in the UK. I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe cracked the top 30. Genesis was no longer underground, they were ascending. But even in the beginning, the seeds of destruction were already there. Gabriel wrote obsessively. He controlled the visuals, the concepts, the costumes, everything. The rest of the band played brilliantly, but in Gabriel's shadow, they were sidemen in their own group. Banks resented it. Hackett felt invisible. Collins was just happy to be there. Rutherford kept the peace. And the machine kept rolling, faster than any of them could control. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Genesis released their first double album, a full-concept record about Rael, a Puerto Rican street kid navigating a surreal urban nightmare. It was ambitious. It was exhausting. It was designed by Hypnosis, the same team behind Pink Floyd's greatest albums. It hit number 10 in the UK and number 41 in the US. The tour was a spectacle. 1,450 slides, 8 projectors, lasers cutting through the darkness. Gabriel wore a glowing suit and, in one scene, inflatable genitalia as the grotesque Slipperman character. It was a theater. It was rock. It was too much. Behind the scenes, everything was falling apart. Gabriel's wife, Jill, had a traumatic childbirth in July 1974. He was traveling between London and Wales, trying to be a husband, a father, and a frontman all at once. Film director William Friedkin wanted to collaborate with him, pulling him further away from the band. And the rest of Genesis? They were tired of being his backing band. In November 1974, somewhere in the middle of the Lamb tour, Gabriel privately told them, "This is my last run." 102 shows later, on May 22, 1975, in Besançon, France, Peter Gabriel played his final note as Genesis's lead singer. 3 months later, Melody Maker broke the story. The frontman, the face, the voice, the vision, was gone. Everyone assumed Genesis was finished. But beneath this triumph of theatricality and progressive mastery, the band had been quietly preparing for survival. They held auditions. 400 singers tried out. None of them fit. So Phil Collins, the drummer who'd been there all along, stepped up to the microphone. A trick of the tail, dropped in 1976. No Gabriel. No guarantee. But it hit number 3 in the UK. Critics and fans were stunned. Genesis didn't just survive. They sounded free. For the first time, the music wasn't weighed down by costumes and 90-minute concept narratives. It breathed, to move. And Collins, shy and self-deprecating, became an unlikely star. But the pressure kept building. Steve Hackett left in 1977, frustrated by the band's shift toward shorter, poppier songs. Now Genesis was a trio: Banks, Rutherford, Collins. Three childhood friends, finally in control. They streamlined. They simplified. They chased the radio. Follow You Follow Me, in 1978 was their first UK top 10 hit. It sold over 1 million copies. It was soft. It was tender. It was everything Genesis used to mock. And it worked. Duke, in 1980 hit number 1 in the UK. 5 million copies sold worldwide. Misunderstanding and Turn It On Again became instant classics. Genesis wasn't just surviving, they were dominating. But what fans didn't see was the creative compromise brewing beneath the hits. Banks still wanted complexity. Collins wanted a groove. Rutherford played mediator, trying to hold two opposite visions together with bass strings and diplomacy. And that's where the trouble began. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. Invisible Touch. This was it, the apex. The album sold over 6 million copies in the US alone, with 1.2 million in the UK. It hit number 3 on the Billboard 200 and number 1 in the UK. 5 singles from one album cracked the US top 5. Invisible Touch, Throwing It All Away, Land of Confusion, In Too Deep, and Tonight, Tonight, Tonight. No British band had ever done that. Genesis matched Michael Jackson. They matched Madonna. They matched Janet Jackson. They were untouchable. Invisible Touch, the single, went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, knocking Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer out of the top spot. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The band Gabriel left behind had just beaten him on the charts. The Invisible Touch tour ran for 112 shows from September 1986 to July 1987. The stage featured a 55-meter LED backdrop with 9 million lights. In Brazil, over 150,000 people watched them play. In July 1987, they sold out Wembley Stadium 4 nights in a row, earning a spot in the Guinness Book of Records. Phil Collins himself said it. These Wembley shows were the peak of Genesis's career. The Land of Confusion video, with its spitting image puppets mocking Reagan and Thatcher, won them a Grammy for Best Concept Music Video in 1988. They were everywhere. MTV, stadiums, magazine covers, award shows. Genesis had become what they once mocked, a pop juggernaut. But that moment of glory was also the beginning of the end. Because while they looked unstoppable on stage, Collins was quietly drowning. He was recording solo albums between Genesis tours, albums that were outselling Genesis itself. No Jacket Required, in 1985 sold 25 million copies, more than any single Genesis album. Collins was one of only 3 artists ever to sell over 100 million records both solo and with a band. The other 2? Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson. Genesis needed Collins. But Collins didn't need Genesis anymore. March 1996. Phil Collins announced his departure from Genesis. Not to take a break, to leave. Permanently. He wanted to focus on his solo career, his acting, his life. The man who'd saved Genesis after Gabriel's exit was now walking away. Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford were blindsided. They'd built this empire together, survived 2 lead singer changes, conquered the world as a trio. And now Collins, the glue, the voice, the hitmaker, was gone. Most bands would have called it quits. But Banks and Rutherford couldn't let go. Genesis was their identity. So they did what they'd done before. They held auditions. The finalists came down to two singers, Ray Wilson, the Scottish frontman of Stiltskin, and David Longdon. On June 6, 1997, Wilson was announced as Genesis's new lead singer. He never stood a chance. Calling All Stations dropped in October 1997. It hit number 2 in the UK, a respectable chart position. But in the United States, where Genesis had built their empire, it peaked at number 54. 54. It was the first Genesis studio album since 1978 not to reach number 1 in the UK. And in America, it barely registered. Critics savaged it. Rolling Stone called it unnecessary. Fans felt betrayed. This wasn't Genesis. This was two guys clinging to a name that no longer meant anything. The North American Arena Tour, 27 dates across major cities, was canceled due to insufficient ticket sales. They scaled it down to 22 dates in smaller venues. That tour was canceled too. Ray Wilson, a talented singer who'd done nothing wrong except accept an impossible job, was booed at shows. Fans chanted for Phil Collins. Some walked out mid-set. Wilson later said he felt like a ghost haunting someone else's legacy. The lowest moment came in rehearsals when it became clear the album wasn't connecting. Banks and Rutherford tried to adapt, tried to make it work, but the magic was gone. Genesis without Gabriel had worked because Collins brought something new. Genesis without Collins just felt hollow. By 1998, Genesis quietly went on indefinite hiatus. No official breakup. No farewell tour. Just silence. The band that had sold over 100 million records, that had filled Wembley Stadium 4 nights running, that had matched the biggest pop stars on earth, couldn't fill mid-sized theaters anymore. Where they went next tells you everything about what Genesis had become. Phil Collins continued his solo dominance. He acted in films. He played Live Aid. He became one of the most recognizable faces in music, selling over 150 million records as a solo artist. He didn't need Genesis, and Genesis had needed him far more than anyone wanted to admit. Peter Gabriel, the man who'd left at the height of their prog-rock fame, became an art rock legend. So, in 1986 sold 5 million copies. Sledgehammer was everywhere. He founded WOMAD, championed world music, won Grammys, and stayed culturally relevant in ways Genesis never could after going pop. Tony Banks released solo albums that prog-rock purists loved and nobody else heard. He composed film scores. He stayed true to the complex, cerebral music Genesis had abandoned. But he remained bitter, bitter that Collins got the glory, bitter that Gabriel got the legend, bitter that Genesis had become a nostalgia act. If you're enjoying this, remember to subscribe for more. Mike Rutherford formed Mike plus the Mechanics, which had hits like The Living Years and Silent Running. He found success outside Genesis, but it was softer, safer, far from the ambitious prog epics he'd helped create. Steve Hackett toured as a solo artist, playing Genesis classics with more reverence than Genesis themselves ever did. Fans who missed the Gabriel era flocked to his shows. He kept the spirit alive while the actual band let it die. Ray Wilson? He returned to his solo career, forever marked as the guy who replaced Phil Collins. He handled it with grace, but the shadow never left. And for nearly a decade, Genesis was dead. But the story wasn't over. Turn It On Again, the tour. Phil Collins, Tony Banks, and Mike Rutherford reunited. Not with Ray Wilson. Not with Peter Gabriel. Just the trio that had ruled the 1980s. It was a massive success. Sold-out arenas, nostalgic crowds, millions in revenue. For a moment, it felt like healing. But Peter Gabriel refused to join. He'd been invited to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in March 2010, where Genesis was finally honored. Collins, Banks, Rutherford, and Steve Hackett all showed up. Gabriel didn't. The absence was deafening. In interviews, Gabriel was diplomatic but distant. He'd moved on. He didn't need Genesis. He didn't want to relive those years of creative suffocation, of being the mascot while the band resented his spotlight. The induction speech by Phish guitarist Trey Anastasio praised Genesis's prog-rock legacy, the era Gabriel defined, but Gabriel himself wasn't there to accept it. The real war wasn't just about who showed up. It was about legacy. Decades later, the battle became about what Genesis meant. Was it the prog-rock pioneers of the early 70s, weaving 23-minute epics and wearing fox heads? Was it the pop titans of the 80s, chasing radio hits and MTV glory? Was it the trio of childhood friends who built an empire? Or was it all of them, and none of them at the same time? Phil Collins developed health problems, nerve damage in his hands, hearing loss, spinal issues. By 2021, he could barely hold drumsticks. But Genesis reunited one final time for The Last Domino tour from 2021 to 2022. Collins sat on a stool, his son Nick playing drums behind him. It was bittersweet, a legend reduced to a figurehead in his own band. The tour was a farewell, but not a reconciliation. Gabriel still wasn't there. Hackett wasn't invited. Ray Wilson was erased from the narrative. Genesis's final chapter was written by the same three men who'd controlled it since 1978, and even they could barely stand each other by the end. The lawsuits never came, but the emotional fractures were irreversible. Interviews grew colder. Collaborations stopped. The only thing they could agree on was that Genesis was over. Millions of dollars earned. Millions of records sold. A Guinness World Record. A Rock and Roll Hall of Fame plaque. And still, decades later, they were at war over what any of it meant. Today, Genesis exists only as a catalog. Phil Collins is retired, his hands too damaged to play. Tony Banks composes in isolation, the prog-rock purist who never got the recognition he believed he deserved. Mike Rutherford tours occasionally, the diplomat who spent 50 years holding fractures together. Peter Gabriel remains a solo icon, the visionary who escaped before the machine consumed him. Steve Hackett is the keeper of the flame, playing the old songs with more love than Genesis ever did. Ray Wilson is a footnote, the singer who dared to step into a legacy that never wanted him. They sold between 100 and 150 million records. They have 21.5 million RIAA-certified albums in the United States. They achieved 11 gold and 4 multi-platinum albums in the UK. They topped charts across the world. They pioneered progressive rock, then abandoned it for pop glory. They survived 2 lead singer changes and became bigger after each loss. But success created legends and enemies. Genesis proved that you can sell 100 million records, fill Wembley Stadium 4 nights running, match Michael Jackson on the charts, and still lose everything that mattered. They became the biggest band in the world by erasing what made them special in the first place. And when the hits stopped coming, all that was left was bitterness, silence, and a legacy no one could agree on. The harmony hid rot. The stadiums hid resentment. The system destroyed the brotherhood. And now, decades later, the only thing Genesis can agree on is that they'll never agree. There are no reunions left. No reconciliations coming. Just 5 brilliant musicians who created something extraordinary and spent the rest of their lives watching it crumble. What part of this story hits you the hardest? Did Genesis lose their soul when they went pop, or did they just evolve? Did you see them live, Gabriel Era, Collins Era, or the final farewell tour? Drop your memories and opinions below. And if this story fascinated you, hit like and subscribe, because the rise and fall of legends never gets old.